When January 1, 1863 arrived, it signaled a major shift in the Civil War, though not for the reasons many people assume today. The Emancipation Proclamation did not instantly free every enslaved person. It was specifically aimed at freeing enslaved people in rebel states, and even then, it came with exceptions. Union-occupied areas of seceded states were exempt, as were the border states that had remained loyal. Beyond that, the Confederate states not exempted had no intention of releasing the enslaved people they had fought to keep. That meant Northern military power was necessary to give the proclamation any teeth. Still, the act carried immense symbolic weight for a great many people. It also formally opened the door for black men to enlist in the Union Army and Navy. Hundreds of thousands of men seeking freedom would eventually join the war effort. By the conflict's end, roughly 200,000 black soldiers had served. Around that same time, the North introduced a draft for its own citizens. The Confederacy had done so a year earlier, but for the Union, instituting conscription reflected a sobering reality. The war was not going as smoothly as President Lincoln had hoped. With the draft in place, both sides readied themselves for more fighting. Two objectives topped the Union's list: defeat General Lee and capture Richmond and take Vicksburg to gain full control of the Mississippi River. The second goal was especially alarming for the South, which had already been struggling to hold its Tennessee border. The Mississippi, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers made it tough to keep Union forces out. General Grant had already seized control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers by capturing Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Union Admiral David Farragut had also taken New Orleans, cutting the Confederacy off from the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, the fall of Memphis had nearly handed the Mississippi to the north. But without Vicksburg, the river remained out of reach. Grant became fixed on taking the city. His first attempt in the summer of 1862, alongside General William T. Sherman, ended in a decisive defeat at the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, forcing a withdrawal. By the following spring, however, they were ready to try again. Up to that point, Grant's forces had barely been able to reach Vicksburg because of the surrounding swamps, bayous, and seemingly impossible terrain. Determined and resourceful, Grant put his men to work transforming the landscape. For weeks they drained bayous, built bridges, and carved out roads that could actually be used to approach the city. Moving along their newly constructed route through Louisiana and across the river, Grant and his army marched toward battle. Grant called on Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter to bring naval support. Despite facing heavy Confederate fire, Porter and his fleet ran the gauntlet with skill, losing only one ship while giving Grant the backup he needed. By April 29, 1863, everything was in place for the assault. Grant's plan unfolded like this. Sherman would simulate an attack at Snyder's Bluff. Colonel Benjamin Garrison would lead a raid farther inland to pull Confederate forces away from Vicksburg. Porter would keep supporting the ground troops, and Major General John A. McClernand, with his 13th Army Corps, would attempt another landing on the east bank of Grand Gulf. That bank was heavily fortified, but Grant was confident in his strategy. The operation began around 8 a.m., with Porter's gunboats opening fire on Fort Wade, followed by Fort Coburn and its defenses. Confederate artillery answered immediately, starting a battle that stretched for hours into the afternoon. The Union Navy eventually overtook Fort Wade, but then stalled against the more resilient Fort Coburn. Even after the first fort fell, Porter and Grant ultimately pulled back, concluding that the second line of defense was too strong. The Battle of Grand Gulf was over, and Grant had hit another obstacle. Vicksburg was starting to feel untouchable, but Grant refused to back down. While Grant focused on Vicksburg, Union General Joseph Hooker had his own task, dealing with General Lee in the north. Hooker also wanted to take the Confederate capital, but first he had to get past Lee. So Hooker readied his army of 115,000 men to attack Lee's much smaller force of 60,000. Hooker divided his troops into 3 parts, sending 2/3 toward Fredericksburg to fake an attack there while he took the rest toward the real objective. Lee, anticipating the move, made a calculated gamble given his disadvantage in numbers. He split off 10,000 of his 60,000 men under General Jubal Early to hold Fredericksburg. Lee then led the remaining 50,000 to meet Hooker's Army of the Potomac. Fighting broke out in a forest just west of Chancellorsville. Despite having a clear numerical advantage and earlier enthusiasm, Hooker suddenly ordered his men into defensive positions, handing Lee an opening. Lee then split his forces again, sending Stonewall Jackson with a portion to sweep around the Union left flank. Jackson drove straight into the Union 11th Corps. Meanwhile, Lee learned of a Union force approaching from the east and divided his troops once more to meet that threat near Salem Church. The overall battle ended in an unexpected Confederate victory. But the South suffered a devastating loss: Stonewall Jackson. Returning to camp after dark with some of his men, the 18th North Carolina Infantry Regiment fired without waiting for identification, mistaking them for Union soldiers. Jackson was hit 3 times, twice in the left arm, once in the right hand. His left arm was amputated, and he later died of pneumonia complications. Lee's response showed the depth of the loss. "I have lost my right arm. I'm bleeding at the heart." Following that costly victory, the Confederacy sought another political win. In response to the Emancipation Proclamation, Jefferson Davis reinforced his previous stance with the Retaliatory Act, which went so far as to permit the execution of captured black Union soldiers and their white officers. That political move was soon followed by more combat. In Mississippi, the Union won at the Battle of Raymond, while the Battle of Jackson ended less decisively. Meanwhile, Grant was steadily making progress toward his target. "The road to Vicksburg is open," Grant told Sherman while asking for reinforcements. Confederate leaders were mired in disputes about their next move, giving the Union a window of opportunity. That window led to the Battle of Champion Hill, later called the Hill of Death by Alvin P. Hovey. The result was a major Union victory and a significant step forward for Grant's Vicksburg campaign. Another win followed at the Battle of Big Black River Bridge, increasing the pressure on Vicksburg. Union forces began digging 15 miles of trenches, and the siege of Vicksburg commenced. Grant felt certain that this time the city would fall. The siege began on May 18th, trapping roughly 29,000 Confederate soldiers under General John C. Pemberton, along with Vicksburg civilians, inside the city. With no supplies and under constant bombardment, Pemberton and those in the city surrendered after 47 days on July 4, 1863. Grant had succeeded. Vicksburg was his, and with it, the Mississippi. But events elsewhere had been unfolding rapidly. In early June, the Battle of Brandy Station in Virginia became the largest cavalry battle of the entire war. That engagement ended with Union forces stalled, and just days later, the Battle of Second Winchester pushed the Yankees out of Shenandoah Valley. Grant's luck seemed better than his comrades, though the Union did have a reason to celebrate on June 20th when West Virginia officially joined as a new state. That celebration was short-lived. Just days later, hours before Grant took Vicksburg, one of the war's most tragic chapters began: the Battle of Gettysburg. General Robert E. Lee, hoping to move the fighting out of war-exhausted Virginia, aimed to take the war north into Pennsylvania. With an army of about 75,000, Lee marched into the Union state, pursued by Union General George Gordon Meade with 95,000 men. The opposing forces converged on the town of Gettysburg, where Lee stopped to prepare for the coming attack. Confederate Major General Henry Heth was advancing toward Lee when he encountered Union Brigadier General John Buford. Buford's men fired on Heth's, and the battle began unexpectedly. The Confederates responded well, pushing the Northerners back along Chambersburg Pike. Though slowed, the Southerners pressed forward. Union Major General John F. Reynolds arrived with the 1st and 11th Corps to support Buford, but it wasn't enough. Reynolds was shot in the neck and killed just as the fighting intensified. More Confederate reinforcements joined, and Generals Robert Rhodes and Jubal Early clashed with Union troops nearby. Together, the rebels began boxing the Yankees in at Gettysburg. As the Union line collapsed, many soldiers escaped along a railroad, but others became trapped in the town. The remaining defenders fell back to Cemetery Hill to the south, forming a fishhook-shaped line. Though surrounded by Southern forces, the Union men held on. Then Union General Dan Sickles moved his 3 corps to Emmitsburg Road and the Peach Orchard, where they encountered Confederate forces under General James Longstreet. Sickles' move backfired, forcing General Meade to send all 5 of his corps to support him. With Longstreet now focusing on the Union left, Lee ordered Hill to strike the center and Richard Ewell to hit the right. Longstreet's men engaged Sickles around Devil's Den and Little Round Top, but made little headway as the Union rushed reinforcements. At the Peach Orchard, however, Sickles' men fared much worse. Casualties mounted to unimaginable levels as the second day of battle continued. The Yankees quickly filled the gaps left by troops sent to support Sickles and managed to push the rebels back at the center. On the right, Generals Ewell and Early tried to overwhelm the Northerners on and around Cemetery Hill as darkness fell. The Union initially held, but the Confederates soon gained ground. Northern reinforcements renewed the fight on the hill. Meanwhile, Confederate General Edward Johnson attacked the Union's far right at Culp's Hill. With many of those troops sent elsewhere, Union General George Greene was left with only 1,300 men to face 4,500 Confederates. Though outnumbered, Greene's men held. By the end of the second day, Gettysburg was already the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. The third day would prove just as brutal. At dawn, General Lee sent reinforcements to his men at Culp's Hill, but General Meade did the same. Now it was the rebels who were outnumbered. Still, they engaged in a 7-hour fight. Early on, the Confederates seemed to be doing well, but by noon the tide had turned in the Union's favor. Instead of reinforcing the right, Lee ordered a full-scale assault on the Union left, a move Meade had unexpectedly anticipated, making him one of the first commanders to outthink Robert E. Lee. That center assault became the largest artillery barrage ever seen in the Western Hemisphere, but it brought no success for the Confederates. Southern forces were forced to march across a mile of open ground toward Emmitsburg Road, where Union troops opened heavy fire, shredding the rebel advance even as Lee urged it forward. A final effort led by General Jeb Stuart to collapse the Union rear also failed. The Southern offensive collapsed on all fronts, and it became clear that the Yankees had won the Battle of Gettysburg. Accepting defeat, Lee withdrew toward the Potomac and back into Virginia. Reportedly, Lee told his men during the retreat that he blamed himself, and he later offered his resignation to President Jefferson Davis. His guilt was understandable. His campaign into the North had produced casualties so high that the wounded alone outnumbered Gettysburg's residents 12-1. Over 3 days, more than 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. Homes and churches became makeshift hospitals, and the town was riddled with bullet holes. Part of the battlefield was soon turned into a national cemetery for fallen Union soldiers. Slain Confederates did not receive the same burial. The Union victory at Gettysburg was, in many ways, overshadowed by the sheer tragedy of it and by the war still grinding on. Excitement over the 54th Massachusetts Colored Infantry, the first African-American volunteer regiment to see combat, was dampened by draft riots that followed. Angry New Yorkers, believing the conscription system favored the wealthy, attacked draft offices and black churches, and the violence spread quickly. The South was struggling as well. The war was draining its economy, raising urgent questions about how much longer it could keep fighting. Small clashes continued through July. At the end of the month, President Lincoln issued General Order 252, declaring that for every black U.S. prisoner of war executed by the South, 1 Confederate prisoner of war would be executed in return. Tensions were rising, and the rebels responded violently. On August 21, 1863, rebel guerrillas under William Clark Quantrill raided Lawrence, Kansas, in what became a massacre. Much of Lawrence was burned, and at least 160 men and boys were killed. It was mass murder, reflecting the deep anger and desperation gripping parts of the South as the war dragged on. Soon after, the Union captured Chattanooga, Tennessee. The Confederates found a brief glimmer of hope with a victory at Chickamauga, and General Braxton Bragg followed up by laying siege to Union-occupied Chattanooga. Meanwhile, Lee and Meade clashed in Virginia during the Bristoe Station campaign. Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. Lee, for his part, hoped to keep Confederate resistance alive long enough to use low Northern morale to help elect a Southern sympathizer in Lincoln's upcoming re-election. But for the rebels, the siege of Chattanooga eventually failed, forcing Bragg into Georgia, and another Confederate siege at Knoxville also fell short. The South had started the war with momentum, but the North's industrial and technological advantages were increasingly making a difference. Both sides wanted the war to end, but neither was ready to surrender. Lee still clung to his broader strategy, while Lincoln offered a different path to any Confederate willing to take it. Swear an oath to the United States, and your rebel past would be forgiven. So by the close of 1863, the war had reached a brutal crossroads. Victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg gave the North momentum, but the fighting was far from over. The next year would test the nation's resolve like never before. If you're interested in more deep looks at the moments that shaped history, subscribe to the War Files HQ and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. There are plenty more stories ahead, and we'd love to have you along for them. Thanks for watching.